Tonight, we step into the heart of Vatican City, where silence is guarded more fiercely than gold. Behind the walls of the Apostolic Palace, the Swiss Guard stand as symbols of loyalty and devotion. But what happens when the guardians themselves become witnesses to a truth too dangerous to speak? A captain found dead at the bronze door, his death written off as an accident. A widow clutching a letter that whispers of betrayal, files hidden under saints' names, coffins that carry doubles, and a secret unit moving relics like currency. For centuries, the Vatican has thrived on secrecy, but in this story, even the guards sworn to defend it begin to fracture under the weight of lies. This is not just about one man's death. It is about a cover-up stretching across ledgers, archives, and the very oath of the Guard itself. A hidden machine fueled by silence, where obedience is demanded and truth is treated as treason. So, before you dismiss this as rumour or myth, ask yourself, what if the most trusted guardians of the Vatican were caught in a conspiracy that reaches from the crypt to the highest office? What if loyalty itself became a weapon? Like the video, subscribe. Because tonight, we uncover the Swiss Guard and the Vatican Assassination cover-up. Some secrets bleed, even when buried. It was just past midnight when the sound split the silence of St. Peter's Square. One gunshot, sharp and echoing against marble and stone, a single crack that seemed to vibrate through the very heart of Vatican City. Tourists had long since vanished, pilgrims asleep in nearby hostels, priests tucked away in their cells. Only the moon and the ancient statues bore witness to the moment the bronze door guarding the papal apartments became stained with blood. A captain of the Swiss Guard lay lifeless on the cold stone steps. His uniform, pressed and immaculate, was marred by a spreading pool of crimson. His halberd rested beside him, as though dropped mid-salute. Within minutes, men in plain cassocks emerged from the shadows, their faces grim, but their actions deliberate. The scene was sealed before dawn. His death, they would later declare, was a tragic accident, an incident not worth more than a passing footnote. But how could a single shot, fired in the holiest square on earth, be brushed away so quickly? The Swiss Guard are sworn to protect the Pope with their lives. Yet that night, one of their own fell not in battle, not on foreign soil, but at the very threshold of the Vatican's power. Guards whispered behind closed doors. How could a man, trained to perfection, armed and armoured, fall to his own weapon? Why were no alarms raised? Why did the bell of St. Peter's remain silent while a captain's life drained into the cracks of the square? Official papers listed it as suicide, others muttered accident, but neither story explained the strange silence that followed. No announcement rang across the city. No funeral bells tolled from the basilica. Instead, by morning, the captain's name had already been erased from the roster of duty, as though he had never existed. His photo vanished from the wall of the barracks. His room was locked and sealed. For the Vatican, the matter was closed, yet the city could not help but ask questions. Some claimed they saw a figure in black leave the square, moments after the gunshot. Others said they heard not one but 2 cracks of gunfire, and a few swore the captain had been cheerful earlier that day, speaking of his family, with no trace of despair. Even more unsettling, the bronze door itself, which had guarded popes for centuries, bore a faint mark of impact, a small scar that should not have been there if the shot had been self-inflicted. The Vatican explained nothing. Silence became their shield. In history, silence is often the loudest clue. When the most secure place in the world loses a man in the dead of night and no explanation follows, the mystery grows heavier than the truth itself. The body was quickly taken to a private chapel. No public viewing, no official press release. Only a single statement that a loyal servant had died unexpectedly while on duty. And so the captain was buried beneath layers of secrecy. But death does not stay buried when questions keep rising. Who pulled the trigger? Why was the truth hidden? And who gains by cloaking an assassination in the robe of an accident? One shot in the night, a pool of blood on sacred stone, and a silence that may conceal more than the darkness ever could. The bells of St. Peter's never rang the next morning. The square looked unchanged, sunlight glinting across marble, pigeons gathering on the colonnade, tourists shuffling in as if nothing had happened. But within the apostolic palace, behind doors locked with centuries of tradition, a very different sound moved through the corridors. Keys turning, locks sealing, papers sliding into boxes. The Secretariat had spoken before dawn. Absolute discretion. No word to the outside, no questions inside. The death of the captain was already being folded into silence. Young recruits of the Swiss Guard sat in the mess hall that morning with tight jaws and uneasy glances. Their commander gave no explanation. His voice was stern, almost rehearsed. They were told to carry on, to guard the Pope as if nothing had occurred. Yet the whispers began. They whispered of the shot, of the blood on the bronze door, of the coffin carried away before the sun rose. Every whisper grew heavier with fear. For in the Guard, loyalty is a shield, but in that moment, loyalty also felt like a chain. As boxes of evidence were carried down into hidden vaults, men in black robes walked alongside the guards. Not soldiers, not officers. Secretaries of the Secretariat, clerks whose faces carried the calm of men, used to burying stories under stone. They catalogued every scrap of paper, every bullet casing, every fragment that could tell what truly happened. Yet once sealed, those boxes would vanish into the labyrinth of the Vatican's archives, where countless secrets have slept untouched for centuries. Rumours rippled through the barracks, like an unseen tide. Some claimed the captain had discovered something he should not have. Others swore the shot came from outside the walls. A few even whispered of betrayal from within, but each rumour was swallowed by the same fear. If the Secretariat had ordered silence, then silence was no longer a choice. It was survival. To speak of the captain was to break the oath of the Guard. To break the oath was to lose everything. By mid-morning, the bronze door had been scrubbed clean. The stain that had once spread across stone was erased as if it had never existed. Tourists passed through later that day, their eyes catching only the gleam of polished marble. None could imagine what had been washed away before their arrival. Even the guards stationed nearby stood motionless, faces like statues, their halberds lifted with perfect discipline, betraying nothing. The silence was not natural, it was enforced. It spread through the ranks like a sickness. Every recruit learned that speaking was dangerous. Every veteran knew that forgetting was safer. Yet beneath their armour, behind their stoic faces, unease burned. For how could they swear to protect the Pope when their own brother had fallen and the truth of his death was already locked away? The keys of the Secretariat turned once more, sealing history in darkness. And in that silence, the first signs of a cover-up had begun. Luca had waited his entire life for this moment. A boy from the quiet valleys of Switzerland now stood in the heart of Vatican City, his hands trembling as he lifted them in the ancient oath. Before him, the commander of the Swiss Guard, flanked by priests in crimson and white, intoned the words that had echoed through generations. Loyalty until death, protection of the Pope at all costs. Obedience without hesitation. Luca's lips repeated them, his voice quivering yet firm, a mixture of pride and fear. He knew his parents back home would hear of this day with joy. He was no longer just a young man, he was a guardian of the Holy Father. The hall was filled with banners, the smell of incense still clinging to the air from the morning mass. New recruits stood in line, their uniforms pressed, halberds polished to a gleam. Each swore the same words, each bowed the same way. Yet when Luca straightened and looked across the chamber, something caught his eye, the roster pinned to the marble wall. A list of names, every officer and every guard on duty, carefully updated each morning. He had studied it often during his training. One name was missing, the name of the captain who had overseen his drills only a week before. Luca blinked, wondering if his eyes had failed him. But no, the nameplate had been removed cleanly. as if it had never existed. The space was not blank, but carefully rearranged, the names shifted to close the gap. It was a roster without flaw, a timeline without a trace. The absence chilled him more than the cold stone beneath his boots. He whispered to the guard beside him, asking where the captain had gone. The man stiffened, shook his head, and muttered one word: silence. That night, Luca could not sleep. He remembered the captain's sharp gaze, his voice barking orders, his corrections precise but fair. The man had been a living presence, impossible to ignore. And now, his memory was gone in less than a day, as if Vatican walls had swallowed him whole. Luca's stomach tightened. He thought of the oath he had taken, the vow to defend with his life. But defend against what? Against who? If the enemy was beyond the gates, why did the fear within the barracks feel heavier? As he lay in his bunk, he heard whispers in the dark. Recruits too nervous to name what had happened, veterans too wise to speak aloud. Everyone sensed the shadow pressing on them, a secret too dangerous to voice. The Vatican, Luca realized, was not only a fortress of faith, but also a fortress of silence, and silence was now his duty, as much as the halberd he held. Yet deep inside, a seed of doubt took root. If an oath demands your silence in the face of truth, is it still loyalty, or is it a cage? That was the question that would haunt Luca long after the night he swore to defend until death. In a quiet apartment beyond the Vatican walls, a woman sat alone with an envelope pressed against her palm. The paper was ordinary, sealed with wax, her name written in the careful script she knew so well. It had arrived hours after the news of her husband's death. Official voices had told her he was gone, that it was an accident, that she should pray and remain strong. But this letter, delivered by a messenger who said nothing and vanished into the night, felt heavier than truth itself. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Only 5 lines of writing covered it, short and cryptic. At first glance they looked like fragments of a prayer or a broken poem. But her husband was a soldier, not a poet. And at the bottom, beneath the lines, one warning stood out, written in darker ink. If I vanish, trust no cassock. Her breath caught. He had known. Somehow he had sensed death waiting before it came. She read the words again and again, her heart pounding with each pass. The lines formed strange patterns, letters rising and falling like coded signals. He had always spoken to her in riddles, when duty forbade plain words. As captain of the Swiss Guard, he knew secrets lived longer when hidden in plain sight. But why now? And why this? She thought back to their final meeting, only 2 days before. He had kissed her cheek and said nothing of danger. Yet behind his eyes there had been a shadow, the kind of weight carried by a man who had seen too much. Outside her window, the bells of Rome rang faintly in the distance. Inside, she felt the cold grip of fear. If he had sent her this letter before dying, then his death was not an accident. He had been silenced. And worse, he had known who might come for her next. The cassock was not a stranger's robe. It was the symbol of those who walked the Vatican halls, men who spoke of God yet hid power behind whispers. If she could not trust them, who could she trust at all? She folded the letter carefully, tucking it inside a locket where no one would think to look. Each word became a seed of suspicion. The cipher, she realized, was not meant for her alone. It was a map, a code pointing to something greater, something he had uncovered and died to protect. But she was only one woman against the weight of the Holy See. If she spoke, she would be dismissed as grieving and unstable. If she stayed silent, the truth would vanish with him. That night, she lit a single candle beside his photograph. The flame flickered as though struggling against the shadows. She whispered his name, promising she would not let his warning be forgotten. Somewhere in the Vatican stone lay the reason for his death. Somewhere behind those locked doors lived the secret he had tried to send her with his final breath. And though fear wrapped itself around her heart, She knew silence would not keep her safe. It never had. The barracks slept in silence, but Luca could not. Every step he took along the corridor felt louder than it should have, echoing off stone walls as though the Vatican itself was listening. His oath bound him to obedience, yet his curiosity pushed him into dangerous ground. He had heard enough whispers to know the captain's death was not as clean as the Secretariat claimed. And now his heart hammered as he slipped into the watch office, a room lined with shelves, papers, and the book every guard relied on, the duty log. The log was always precise, every shift noted, every officer recorded down to the minute. Yet tonight, something felt wrong, even before he touched it. The room smelled faintly of ink, fresher than it should at that hour. His hand hovered over the ledger, its leather cover warm from recent use. He opened it slowly and scanned the pages. At first glance, all seemed normal. Names, times, posts, movements. But then he saw it, a line where the ink had not yet dried. Letters blurred when he touched them, as if written only moments ago, and the times did not match. He leaned closer, tracing the neat columns with his finger. One entry claimed the captain had signed off at 10 minutes past midnight. Another line insisted he had been replaced at 11:45. Two records of the same man at two different times. Impossible, unless someone had tampered with the log to erase what truly happened between those moments. The more Luca studied it, the more the page looked like a puzzle forced into place. The strokes of the pen were too hurried, the spacing too tight. Someone had written over history in the middle of the night. His stomach tightened as the realization sank in. This was not a mistake, it was deliberate. The log had been locked inside this office, and only officers with high clearance had keys. That meant the change had been ordered from above. He thought of the captain's name already removed from the roster, of the silence that had been forced upon the guard. Now he held proof in his hands, ink that betrayed the lie. But proof was also danger. If anyone found him here, crouched over the pages with sweat on his brow, he would not be questioned, he would be condemned. Guards swore to obedience, not investigation, and yet he could not look away. He copied the mismatched hours into his memory, every digit burning into his thoughts. Then he closed the book carefully, wiping the smear of ink he had left. The office felt colder as he slipped back into the hall. Every shadow seemed to move, every door a threat. He returned to his bunk with his heart racing, knowing that silence would have been safer, yet silence was no longer possible. The logbook had spoken, the times were wrong, the ink was fresh, and the truth had been locked away, not in a vault, but in plain sight, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to notice. In the dim light of the Vatican library, dust floated like golden threads through the air. The smell of parchment and candle wax filled the vast room, where endless shelves stretched into shadows. At the far end sat Sister Caterina, an archivist whose hands were always hidden by white gloves. She had tended to the Vatican's oldest manuscripts for more than 50 years, her eyes sharp despite her age, her memory sharper still. Few spoke to her, for she seemed like a relic herself, part of the library's silence. Yet when Luca brought her the strange letter, folded and worn from the widow's trembling fingers, she leaned closer with sudden fire in her gaze. She read the 5 lines slowly, lips moving without sound. Her gloved finger traced the words, pausing at the first letter of each line. She whispered, almost to herself, that it was an acrostic. Luca frowned, not understanding. Sister Caterina smiled faintly, as if hearing an old melody after years of silence. She explained that during the 16th century, the Swiss Guard had devised a code to send warnings under the eyes of powerful men. Each line's first letter formed a hidden word, a key that only those trained in the tradition could read. It had been thought lost to time, abandoned when secrecy became too dangerous. Yet here it was, alive again in a dead captain's final words. Luca leaned closer as she spelled it out. The letters formed the word Pietas. At first it seemed simple, a Latin word for duty and devotion. But Sister Caterina shook her head. In the Guard's secret code, it meant something far more specific. Pietas was the name of a ledger hidden centuries ago. A book where the Guard recorded not only duties, but betrayals, assassinations, and silenced scandals. Only a few fragments of it were rumoured to survive, buried deep within the archives. The captain, she said, must have uncovered a trail leading to it. The air seemed heavier as her words sank in. The cipher was not just a warning, it was a map. The widow's letter pointed towards something buried beneath centuries of ink and stone. Sister Caterina's eyes softened, but her voice lowered to a whisper. She told Luca that knowledge was never safe in the Vatican. What was preserved was often not for truth, but for power. Many manuscripts had been locked away, not because they were false, but because they were too true. And truth, she warned, was the most dangerous possession of all. She folded the letter again and slid it back to Luca. Her white gloves trembled as though she had touched fire. She warned him that once he stepped onto this path, he could never return to silence. He would be watched, he would be tested, and he would need to decide if his loyalty lay with the oath he had sworn or with the truth the oath had buried. Luca tucked the letter against his chest, feeling the weight of centuries pressing on him. For the first time, he understood that the captain's death was only the beginning. The cipher had opened a door, and behind it lay shadows older than his own family name. In the small laboratory tucked beneath the Apostolic Palace, the hum of old machines blended with the smell of oil and iron. It was here that the captain's uniform had been laid out, his armour plates removed, his body examined under the eye of Vatican forensics. The official line had already been decided before the examination even began. A single shot, they said, a tragic act of despair, nothing more. Yet when the bullets were pulled and measured, the truth refused to stay buried. One slug was small, a 9mm round lodged deep in the captain's chest. The second was larger, heavier, and of a calibre not used by the Swiss Guard. It had torn through the shoulder, leaving a wound that could not be mistaken. 2 different bullets, 2 different weapons. The technicians froze, knowing at once what it meant. The captain had not fallen by his own hand. There had been another gun, another shooter, standing in the square that night. The evidence was undeniable. But inside the Vatican, undeniable was never the same as admissible. The senior examiner arrived quietly, his cassock brushing the floor as he read the notes. His face remained calm, his voice even, but his hand tore the page from the report and slipped it into his pocket. He ordered the others to rewrite everything. 1 bullet only, 1 wound, 1 conclusion. The larger round was sealed away in a small box without label, slipped into a cabinet no one would ever open without permission. By morning, the official record declared exactly what the Secretariat desired. A single gun, a single shot, a single tragedy. The second bullet no longer existed, yet the phantom of it haunted those who had seen. The younger examiner whispered about it after hours, his conscience gnawing at him. He told a colleague who told another, until the rumour spread through the Guard like smoke. 2 bullets, 2 calibers, 2 truths colliding in one body. But like all dangerous truths, it lived only in whispers. No one dared put it on paper again. To do so was to challenge the silence the Secretariat had already locked into place. For Luca, the discovery reached him not through reports, but through fragments of conversation caught in the mess hall. Hurried words exchanged between men who lowered their voices when he entered. He pieced them together slowly, realizing that the night of the captain's death had been far darker than anyone admitted. If one bullet was official and the other erased, then history itself had been split. The Vatican had chosen the version that suited them and buried the rest. A phantom bullet had been born, invisible yet undeniable, erased yet unforgettable. And phantoms never rest. They follow They whisper. They pull at the threads of silence until the fabric itself begins to tear. Luca knew now that the captain's death was no accident, no suicide. It was a killing carried out with precision, and the proof of it had been hidden in plain sight. One bullet told the story of despair. The other told the story of murder. Only one was allowed to survive. The bells had not yet rung for evening prayer when the order came. Senior guards were summoned to the inner hall, a place rarely used except for ceremonies of correction. The younger recruits were left behind, told nothing, though the look in the veterans' eyes as they marched away was enough to chill the air. Luca lingered near the door, heart pounding, listening to the heavy footsteps fade. He knew what this meant. Something was about to be sealed, not by ink or by locks, but by oath. Inside the hall, the walls glowed with candlelight, shadows stretching long across painted saints who seemed to watch with sorrow. The commander stood at the front, flanked by priests in dark robes. His face was stern but not angry, his voice measured but heavy with warning. He spoke of loyalty, of the sacred trust given to the Guard since the 16th century. He spoke of obedience not as a choice, but as the foundation of their very existence. And then his words grew sharper. Those who whispered of murder, he declared, were not only dishonouring the captain's memory, they were betraying the Pope himself. The guards shifted uneasily, hands tightening on their halberds. Many had served long years, had given their youth to this service. They were men of discipline, but they were also men who had seen too much. They knew when truth was being buried, yet none dared to raise a voice. The commander's warning was clear. To speak of murder was to break the oath, and breaking the oath was the one sin no forgiveness could touch. A brother who spoke out would be cast out. Worse, he would be remembered not as a soldier, but as a traitor. One by one, the guards were made to kneel, swearing again the ancient promise of silence. It was called Fraternal Correction, a reminder that their loyalty was first to the order, and only through the order to God. Each word they spoke bound them tighter to secrecy. The hall was thick with incense, thick with fear. The priests nodded with satisfaction as the last guard swore, as though a dangerous fire had been smothered. But in truth, the fire was only forced underground, where it would smoulder hotter and darker than before. When the doors opened again, the senior guards filed out, with faces carved from stone. None spoke. None looked at the younger recruits waiting in the barracks. They sat at their tables, ate in silence, and prepared for duty as though nothing had happened. But the air had changed. Every man knew it. The captain's death could no longer be questioned. The truth had been sealed beneath the weight of an oath older than any of them. Luca felt the chain of silence wrap tighter around his chest. He had taken the same oath only days before, swearing loyalty unto death. Now that same vow was being used as a weapon to erase memory. Murder was not forbidden because it had not happened. Murder was forbidden because to speak it aloud threatened power. The pact of silence had been written, not in ink, but in the fear of men who had no choice but to obey. The night was damp and heavy with mist, as Luca lingered in the shadows near the Borgo gate. The city outside hummed faintly with tavern voices and distant bells, but here in the narrow passageways the silence felt sharper than a blade. He had been told to remain in the barracks, yet something had pulled him to the wall. Some instinct whispering that truth moved at night. And then he saw him. A tall figure draped in a black cassock, his face hidden beneath the edge of a hood, his movements too deliberate for a simple priest. The guards on duty looked away as he passed, as if instructed not to see him. Luca's breath caught when he realized this was the man whispered of only by initial, Monsignor N. No one seemed to know his full name, yet his presence weighed like lead. He stepped through the gate and was met not by clergy, but by two men in plain suits, strangers who did not belong in the Vatican at that hour. They spoke quickly, voices low, exchanging a folder and a small leather case. Luca pressed closer to hear, his body pressed against cold stone, every heartbeat threatening to give him away. Words drifted through the air, sharp fragments. Shipments, ledger, silence. It was enough to confirm his fear. The death of the captain was not an isolated act. It was tied to something larger, something that reached beyond the walls into the streets of Rome. Luca inched forward, trying to see their faces, but his boot scraped against gravel. The sound was small, but it cut through the night like a bell. The men froze. Monsignor N turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the shadows. Luca's lungs seized. He pressed himself deeper into the dark, praying that the cloak of night would hide him. One of the suited men stepped closer, suspicion burning in his stare. For a moment, Luca was sure he was caught, sure that the oath he had sworn would be twisted into a sentence of silence. But then a carriage rattled down the cobblestone road, its wheels clattering loud enough to break the stillness. The strangers turned back, slipping into the mist, and Monsignor N vanished with them through the gate. When the danger passed, Luca exhaled, his body trembling. He had almost been discovered, almost silenced, before he could even begin to uncover the truth. Yet, what he had seen was enough. Monsignor N was no ordinary priest. He was meeting agents under the cover of night, passing secrets in the very place where the guard was meant to stand watch. And the fact that the guards at the gate pretended not to see proved it was sanctioned from above. As Luca returned to the barracks, his mind burned with questions. What was in the folder? What shipments were they hiding? And why had the captain died only days before? He knew now that the Vatican's shadows stretched deeper than any oath. The black cassock was not a robe of faith, but a cloak of secrecy, and behind it moved the hands that had written the captain's death into silence. The basilica was nearly empty when Sister Caterina guided Luca through the side aisle, her white gloves clasped tightly, as though even touching the air required caution. The Pietas rested in its glass case, the marble mother cradling her fallen son beneath the dim glow of evening lamps. Tourists had long since left, leaving only silence and the faint sound of prayers drifting from a distant chapel. Luca followed closely, his heart racing. He knew she had promised him something more than words, something the Vatican would never allow him to see. She stopped at a marble plinth near the statue, an ordinary pedestal that most visitors ignored. With hands that shook only slightly, she pressed along its edge until a small stone shifted loose. Luca watched as a hidden panel opened, revealing a hollow space within. From it, she pulled a leather-bound book, its surface cracked with age, its spine nearly falling apart. She whispered that this was not meant to be found, that even she had discovered it only after years of wandering the archives. Luca opened the ledger with care. Inside, the pages were filled with columns of stipends, payments written in neat Latin script. But the names were strange. There were no priests, no officers, no familiar titles. Only a recurring entry marked Section S. The sums were large, far too great for ordinary expenses, and the frequency of the payments was disturbing. Each month, without fail, for decades, money had flowed into this mysterious unit, and beside some of the entries were notes in shorthand, words Luca did not understand but that Caterina translated in whispers. Transfers, relocations, silence fees. The air grew heavier as Luca turned the pages. He realized this ledger was more than a book of accounts. It was a map of hidden operations, a record of shadows moving through the Vatican's history. The captain's death now felt less like an isolated tragedy and more like a consequence of crossing paths with Section S. Whatever this unit was, it operated with resources and protection that reached into the heart of the church itself. Caterina's eyes gleamed with both fear and sorrow. She explained that Section S had been whispered of for centuries, a group buried within the Guard itself, tasked not with defence, but with silencing threats. Their stipends were hidden under layers of bookkeeping, impossible to detect unless one knew where to look. The captain must have found this same ledger, or another like it, and once he did, his fate was sealed. Luca closed the book, his hands trembling. He knew what it meant to hold such knowledge. He also knew that even possessing this ledger placed him in danger greater than any sword or bullet. But the thought of silence burned hotter than fear. The Pietas watched over them in marble stillness, a mother mourning her son. Luca could not shake the feeling that she mourned also for the sons of the Guard, who had been sacrificed to protect secrets too dark to speak. The ledger beneath the Pietas was not simply history. It was proof that the Vatican's shadows had been written into its very foundation. The letter had haunted the widow for days, its 5 lines of coded words circling in her mind like a prayer she could not escape. When Luca studied it again under Sister Caterina's careful gaze, the pattern began to reveal itself. The letters did not only form the word Pietas. They pointed to something larger, a path hidden within the Vatican museums themselves. Each word, each subtle reference, was a clue. It was as though the captain had left behind a trail for those brave enough to follow, a red thread through a labyrinth of marble and silence. By morning, Luca entered the museums under the pretense of routine patrol. Tourists moved in clusters, gazing up at frescoes, marveling at tapestries, unaware of the shadows that lived behind the walls. Luca's eyes traced the path spelled out in the cipher. First the gallery of maps, where a particular panel of Italy bore a tiny symbol scratched into the frame. He slipped closer, pretending to study the coastline, and beneath the wood he felt a folded slip of paper taped into place. A fragment of a report, words half burned, yet still legible. Transfer ordered. Witness removed. His pulse quickened. The second waypoint was deeper inside, near the Egyptian collection where mummies lay silent behind glass. Here the cipher guided him to a column carved with hieroglyphs, its base chipped with age. Luca knelt, as if inspecting the stone, and found another piece of paper pressed beneath a loose corner. This fragment carried only 2 words, Section S. He tucked it into his jacket before anyone noticed. Each waypoint felt more dangerous than the last. He passed tourists, guards, even priests, his face calm, though his heart pounded. In the gallery of animals, hidden behind a bronze statue of a lion, another shred waited. It spoke of relocation, though the rest was torn away. In the hall of busts, beneath the likeness of a forgotten emperor, yet another fragment whispered of an order sealed by the Secretariat. Piece by piece, the shredded report was being stitched back together, the red thread pulling him further into the maze. By the time Luca reached the final waypoint, the Vatican museums were beginning to close. The last tourists drifted toward the exits, their voices fading like distant echoes. He stood before the Raphael rooms, the walls alive with painted saints and philosophers. The cipher had guided him here, to the school of Athens, where Plato and Aristotle gestured in eternal debate. Luca scanned the fresco carefully, then his eyes caught a faint mark near the base. Tucked behind a small panel was the last fragment, stained and brittle. It spoke of a captain, initials obscured, declared a liability. His removal was necessary for the preservation of silence. Luca held the pieces in his trembling hands, the shredded report, now a mosaic of betrayal. The cipher had been the red thread leading him through the halls of art and history, yet what it revealed was no beauty at all. It was the proof of an assassination disguised as an accident, buried within the very heart of the Vatican's treasures. The widow had carried the key, the captain had left the map, and now Luca knew that the truth had been scattered like fragments of a broken statue, waiting for someone willing to gather them back together. The bronze door gleamed under the lamps, as if nothing had ever stained its steps. Tourists walked by in daylight, snapping photographs of the guards, never guessing that only nights before blood had spread across those very stones. For Luca the square felt different now, as though every shadow carried memory. He had begun to search for answers in every corner, and it was during one of these quiet patrols that he noticed the camera. A small black eye above the colonnade, aimed directly at the door. It should have seen everything. It should have captured the captain's last breath. Yet, When Luca asked about the footage, the answer was silence. The request was brushed aside by the guard officer. The files, he said, were corrupted. The camera had malfunctioned. There was nothing to review. Luca felt his stomach turn. In the Vatican, nothing was left to malfunction. Every device was tested, every angle protected. He could not let it rest, so he slipped into the monitoring room one evening when the clerk had gone to supper. Screens glowed in rows, showing the courtyards, the gates, the basilica. He traced back the feeds, searching for the night of the death. At first, the footage looked ordinary. Guards pacing, lamps flickering, but then he saw it. The recording was too perfect. The same guard walked past at the same interval again and again. The same pigeon fluttered in and out of the frame with mechanical timing. The video was a loop, played on repeat to cover the exact hours of the killing. Someone had replaced the real feed with a copy so seamless only a careful eye would notice. Luca leaned closer, rewinding, fast-forwarding. The pattern never changed. The night of the murder had been erased not with fire, but with firmware. Digging deeper into the files, he found something even stranger. The camera itself had been replaced a week earlier, signed off by Monsignor N with the approval of the Secretariat. The papers called it a routine upgrade, but the truth was clear. A new camera had been installed not to improve security, but to control it, and its firmware, loaded with the false loop, was the lock on the coffin of the captain's story. Luca's breath caught as he realized what this meant. The murder had not been a crime of impulse, it had been prepared in advance. Someone had ensured that no record would survive, that the only eyes on the bronze door would lie. He sat in the glow of the screens, the false footage staring back at him, and felt the weight of conspiracy settle on his shoulders. When he returned to the barracks, the words of his oath rang in his ears: defend to the death. But who was he defending now? A church that rewrote its own memories, or the truth buried under its stones? The camera had disappeared, replaced by silence disguised as surveillance. And Luca knew the most dangerous weapon in the Vatican was not the sword or the gun. It was the power to decide what the world was allowed to see. Rome at night was never truly dark. The glow of street lamps painted the cobblestones, and the echo of motorbikes hummed through the alleys. Luca moved cautiously through Trastevere, a hood drawn low, every step measured. He had been given an address written on a scrap of paper by Sister Caterina, who told him in a whisper that not all guards had stayed within the walls. Some had vanished, leaving their uniforms behind, but carrying secrets too heavy to bury. Tonight, Luca would meet one of them. The building looked ordinary, its windows shuttered, its walls weathered like every other house on the street. He knocked once, paused, then twice as instructed. The door creaked open to reveal a man with grey hair and eyes that darted sharply in every direction. He said, no name, only motioned Luca inside before locking the door. The room smelled of dust and old tobacco. Curtains were drawn tight. On the table lay a single candle and a bottle of cheap wine. The man poured 2 glasses with hands that trembled slightly. He admitted he had once been what Luca now was, a soldier of the guard sworn to protect the Pope. But he had left, abandoning not only his post but his very name. The Vatican called him a deserter. He called himself a survivor. His voice was tired, yet his eyes carried the weight of memories that refused to fade. Luca listened in silence, waiting for the truth he had come to find. From beneath a drawer, the man pulled a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, creased from years of hiding. When Luca held it under the candlelight, his breath caught. It showed the captain, alive and stern in his uniform, standing beside Monsignor N, and next to them, half in shadow, was a man Luca did not recognize, not a priest, not a guard. His suit was foreign, his stance that of someone used to power, but not ceremony. The former guard spoke his name softly. An operative, tied to an intelligence agency outside the Vatican. a man whose presence within the walls should have been impossible. The photo was proof that the captain had stepped too close to something forbidden. His connection with Monsignor N and this shadowy figure meant he had uncovered dealings that crossed borders and blurred loyalties. The deserter warned Luca that the Vatican was not only guarding the Pope, it was guarding secrets that reached into governments, banks, and networks of power that thrived in the dark. The captain had been caught in the middle, and once caught, there had been only one way to silence him. Luca tucked the photograph carefully into his jacket, his mind spinning. The deserter's eyes softened, though his words carried no comfort. He told Luca to leave before it was too late. Those who followed the trail of Section S rarely lived long enough to speak of it. The candle flickered, throwing shadows across the walls, and Luca felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had come seeking answers, and now he held one in his hand. The captain's death was not just a tragedy, it was a message. And the men who sent it were still watching. The news came without warning. At dawn, the commander entered the barracks with a sheet of orders in his hand, his expression carved in stone. 2 guards were to be transferred immediately to distant posts in Switzerland, far from the walls of the Vatican. No explanation, no farewell, only a crisp reading of their names and a command to pack. Their faces betrayed shock, yet they obeyed without question, gathering their belongings in silence. By midday, they were gone, their rooms stripped bare, as if they had never stood in uniform. That evening, another announcement followed. A 3rd guard, a veteran who had served nearly 2 decades, had submitted his resignation. The words were spoken with ceremony, but the man's eyes told another story. He had not chosen to leave. His departure was a sentence disguised as choice. By nightfall, his locker was emptied, his name scratched off the duty roster. 3 men gone in a single day, 3 voices removed from the ranks. Luca felt unease gnaw at him. These were not random shifts of duty. This was a purge. Someone was clearing the board, moving pieces out of play before they could speak. He remembered the whispers about 2 bullets, the altered logbook, the camera that had lied. The men who vanished had been the ones closest to those secrets. Each had been stationed near the bronze door the night of the captain's death. Each had likely seen or heard something they should not have. Now they were gone, erased with the same precision as the captain's name from the records. The barracks grew colder in their absence. The younger recruits watched nervously, afraid to ask questions, afraid even to look at the empty bunks. The veterans kept their heads down, their silence heavier than words. No one needed to say it aloud. They all knew this was a warning. Speak of the captain, and you too would vanish. Luca lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling beams above his bed. The purge was not only about removing men, it was about spreading fear, teaching the rest of the guard that loyalty meant forgetting. He thought of the deserter in Rome, the photograph of Monsignor N with the foreign operative, the ledger beneath the Pietas. Each fragment of truth now felt like a burning coal in his hands, dangerous to hold, yet impossible to drop. If Section S had the power to erase guards with a word, how much longer before they turned their eyes toward him? As the bells rang midnight, Luca understood the game being played. The Vatican was not a fortress of faith alone. It was a chessboard where lives were pawns, moved or sacrificed for reasons hidden in shadows. And someone, unseen but ruthless, was already clearing the pieces that threatened their plan. The purge had begun. The only question was, how many moves remained before Luca himself was taken from the board? The crypt chapel beneath St. Peter's Basilica glowed faintly with candlelight, its air thick with incense and centuries of prayer. Marble tombs lined the walls, each marked with the names of popes and saints, men whose bodies lay in silence beneath carved stone. On this night, another coffin had been placed at the centre, draped in the flag of Switzerland, the colours stark against the pale marble floor. It was said to hold the captain of the Swiss Guard, whose sudden death had been declared an accident. Yet the ceremony felt strangely hollow, as though something essential was missing. Only a handful of guards were present, standing rigid with halberds in hand. Their faces betrayed nothing, though their eyes flickered with unease. A priest recited prayers in Latin, his voice echoing through the chamber. The widow had been told she could not attend, that this was a private rite, reserved for those bound by oath. No one questioned the decision aloud, though all felt the weight of its cruelty. The coffin remained sealed, no final viewing allowed. The captain's face, the proof of his end, was hidden forever. Sister Caterina stood at the edge of the chapel, her white gloves clasped before her. She had been permitted to observe as archivist, though she suspected her presence was more tolerated than welcomed. As the prayers continued, she watched closely, her sharp eyes noting details others ignored. When the guards lifted the coffin to carry it toward the burial niche, she frowned. The weight was wrong. She had seen countless processions in her years, had witnessed the bearing of bodies down these very steps. She knew how a coffin should press into the arms of men. This one felt too light. The guards carried it with ease, their shoulders unstrained, their steps too steady. Caterina's heart clenched. Either the body inside had been tampered with, or worse, it was not there at all. She leaned closer, listening to the creak of wood as it was lowered. No shifting sound, no weight pressing against its sides. Her suspicion hardened into certainty. The coffin was empty. The priest concluded the prayers, making the sign of the cross. The coffin was sealed into its resting place. A slab of marble slid across the opening with a groan that echoed like finality. But Caterina knew it was a lie carved in stone. The captain had not been buried here. His body, or whatever remained of it, had been taken elsewhere. The coffin was nothing more than a symbol, a hollow vessel meant to silence questions with the appearance of ritual. When the ceremony ended, the guards filed out in silence, their faces pale in the flickering light. Caterina lingered, her eyes fixed on the marble slab. She whispered a prayer, not for the soul of the man within, but for the truth that had been stolen from him. She knew Luca must be told. The Vatican had buried not a captain, but a secret. And secrets, no matter how carefully sealed, never stay hidden forever. The Vatican at night was quieter than any monastery, yet beneath its silence, legal battles unfolded that few ever knew existed. Luca had been summoned to a dim chamber near the Apostolic Palace, where shelves of leather-bound volumes loomed like silent judges. Waiting for him was an elderly canon lawyer, a man whose face bore the deep lines of decades spent untangling the Church's laws. His voice was soft, but his words carried the gravity of confession. He told Luca that something had been set in motion, not in the open halls of justice, but in the shadows of a secret tribunal. The lawyer explained that it was called the Hidden Rotor, an echo of the Roman Rotor, the highest appellate court of the Church. But unlike its public counterpart, this tribunal never appeared on paper. It convened only when matters were deemed too dangerous for daylight, when the preservation of the institution outweighed the pursuit of truth. Its members were chosen in silence, their rulings recorded only in memory, not in ink. And their purpose, he said, was simple: scandal prevention. The phrase sounded harmless, almost bureaucratic, but the lawyer's tone revealed its darker weight. Scandal prevention was the legal veil through which evidence vanished. If a priest was found guilty of crimes too shameful, his records were erased under the seal of this tribunal. If a death occurred under suspicious circumstances, the hidden rotor could declare it unworthy of inquiry. It did not matter what the facts were. What mattered was that the faithful never lost trust in the Church. Truth was not destroyed, it was buried beneath rulings crafted to ensure silence. Luca listened in disbelief, the pieces clicking into place. The altered logbook, the missing bullet, the looping camera, the empty coffin, all were not random acts of cover-up. They had been sanctioned, cloaked in legal authority so that no one inside the Vatican could question them without being branded disloyal. The captain's death had been placed before this tribunal, the lawyer whispered, and the verdict had already been decided. It was not suicide, not murder, not even an accident. Officially, it was nothing. It had been ruled irrelevant for the sake of scandal prevention. The lawyer's eyes glistened with sorrow. He admitted that he had once believed in the purity of canon law, in its ability to defend both justice and faith, but over time he had seen it twisted, reshaped into a tool of concealment. The hidden rotor had become the most powerful court of all, not because of its rulings, but because no one outside its chamber even knew it existed. He warned Luca that challenging it was impossible. The tribunal did not punish with trials or prisons. It punished with erasure. Those who defied it simply disappeared from records, as though they had never lived. As Luca left the chamber, the lawyer pressed a rosary into his hand. Not for prayer, but as a reminder. The beads, he said, were counted to keep track of something unseen. In the same way, Luca must learn to count the missing pieces, the vanished names, the empty coffins. For in those absences lay the truth. And behind every silence stood the hidden rotor, cloaking lies in the language of law. The armory of the Swiss Guard was a place of ritual as much as steel. Rows of halberds gleamed under lantern light, their blades polished until they shone like mirrors. Armour hung in ordered lines, muskets and pistols locked in cases, every weapon maintained with the care of a relic. For centuries these tools had stood as symbols of loyalty, each halberd more than a weapon, each blade a reminder of the oath sworn to defend the Pope. Yet hidden among them was something far removed from faith or honour. Luca entered under the guise of nightly inspection, his steps echoing on the stone floor. He moved past the familiar weapons, his hand brushing against wood and steel, until he reached a halberd older than the rest. Its shaft bore small scratches that others might dismiss as age, but Luca noticed a faint notch near the binding. He pressed it, and with a soft click, a compartment slid open. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a tiny reel of microfilm, its surface glinting under the lantern. His breath caught. This was no ordinary weapon. It was a hiding place. He unrolled the film carefully under the light. The letters were small but sharp, financial records etched in neat rows. Dates, account numbers, and transfers flowed down the strip like a river of shadows. And there, repeated again and again, was a name he had never heard before: Foundation Aurelia. The amounts transferred to it were staggering, far beyond the budget of the Guard, beyond even the reach of normal Vatican expenses. And in the margins, scribbled in code, was the one phrase that sent a chill through him: Section S. It was clear now. The secret unit was not funded through ordinary stipends or salaries. It was fueled by hidden bank channels, money washed clean through a foundation that did not exist on any public record. Luca realized this was how Section S could move with such power, able to pay men to vanish, to silence witnesses, to bribe those who might speak. The captain must have found the same trail, and once he did, his fate was sealed. He rolled the film back and hid it inside his jacket, his mind racing. The halberd was returned to its place, its secret now burned into Luca's memory. He thought of the irony. A blade once meant to protect had instead become the vessel of corruption, carrying not honour but proof of betrayal. The very weapon sworn to defend truth had been turned into a sheath for lies. As he left the armoury, Luca felt the weight of the film pressing against his chest. The Foundation Aurelia was not just a name. It was the artery feeding Section S, the invisible hand funding every shadow act buried by the hidden rotor. He knew he could not keep this knowledge to himself, but he also knew that by holding it, he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The Swiss blade had revealed its secret, and now its edge cut deeper than steel. It cut into the heart of the Vatican itself. The sacristy was always a place of preparation, where priests robed themselves in silence before stepping into the grandeur of St. Pietas. On most days, it was filled with the rustle of cassocks, the clink of chalices, the faint murmur of prayers. But one night, under the dim glow of a single lamp, a figure entered who did not belong. Dressed as a pilgrim, his cloak drawn tightly around him, He carried no candle, no rosary, no sign of devotion. He moved with the precision of someone who knew the layout too well. Luca noticed him first. When he passed the side corridor during his patrol, pilgrims never entered the sacristy unaccompanied, yet the figure slipped inside without a word, as if every locked door had already been opened for him. Luca followed at a distance, careful to let the shadows cover his steps. The man walked swiftly through the chamber, avoiding the main exits, until he reached a narrow passage reserved for staff. He disappeared into it, as though guided by memory, not chance. By the time Luca reached the corridor, the figure was gone, but the guard at the post confirmed what he had seen. A man, cloaked as a pilgrim, had walked past, showing no papers, leaving as silently as he had arrived. Suspicion rose, and for once, protocol was followed. The doorknob, the handle he had touched, was dusted. Fingerprints were lifted and sent through the Vatican's restricted system, cross-checked with European databases. The result came back within hours. No match, no identity. The man was a ghost, a pilgrim with no face. The discovery spread in whispers. Some said he was an agent, others a priest, travelling under disguise, perhaps even one of the legendary Section S. Yet none could explain how he entered without record, how he left without question, how even his fingerprints refused to tie him to the world outside. For Luca, it was another thread leading back to the captain's death. The ghost visitor had entered within the same week, moving through staff corridors known only to insiders. Someone had granted him passage, someone with the power to erase traces. Late that night, Luca returned to the sacristy, staring at the doors the figure had crossed. The air was heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the secret. He thought of the photograph from the deserter, the ledger beneath the Pietas, the microfilm hidden in the halberd. Each clue painted the same picture. Outsiders were moving freely within the Vatican, protected by insiders who ensured their shadows left no mark. The pilgrim with no face was not a lone intruder. He was a sign that borders had blurred, that the line between faith and espionage had long been crossed. Standing in the silence, Luca realized the greatest danger was not what the man had done, but what he represented. If a ghost could walk the Vatican halls unnoticed, then no guard, no oath, no law could truly defend the truth. The walls were sacred, but the shadows within them were not. The Vatican gardens looked peaceful in the daylight, a sanctuary of fountains, hedges, and quiet paths where pilgrims never strayed. Yet beneath the flowers and stone walkways lay another world, a relic of wartime when Rome had feared invasion and the Vatican prepared for the worst. Few remembered the tunnels dug deep below, fewer still knew the locked iron doors that led into them. Luca found one such door hidden behind a wall of ivy, its hinges rusted, its lock scarred by time. Sister Caterina's whispers of forgotten passages had guided him here, and with effort he pried it open. The air inside was damp, heavy with the smell of earth and old brick. He followed the tunnel by lantern, the floor uneven beneath his boots, the silence broken only by the drip of water echoing in the dark. After what felt like hours, the passage widened into a chamber. The walls were lined with thick padding, strange in a place meant for refuge. At the far end, two narrow lanes stretched into shadow, their marks unmistakable. Firing lanes. Luca's chest tightened. He had stumbled upon an underground range. Dust coated the floor, but recent footprints cut through it, clear evidence the place had not been abandoned. On a wooden table he found fragments of brass casings, scattered like forgotten breadcrumbs. He picked one up, turning it under the light. It was heavier than the 9mm rounds carried by the guard. Larger, sharper, the second caliber. The phantom bullet that had been erased from the captain's report. The realization struck him with brutal clarity. The captain had not been killed by chance. His death had been rehearsed here, beneath the gardens where tourists strolled in ignorance. This was where Section S had tested weapons, where they had trained their hand. The second round had not been a mistake. It had been the signature of a hidden unit with access to places no one else knew existed. Luca's pulse raced as he explored deeper. The chamber held targets riddled with holes, their outlines shaped like human silhouettes. The soundproofing explained why no one above had ever heard. Here, shots could echo endlessly without reaching the surface. A secret firing range in the heart of the Vatican, built not for protection, but for practice in silence. The bunker told its own story, one written in powder and lead. He traced his hand along the cold wall, the truth pressing down on him like the earth above. The Vatican had buried not only tunnels, but intentions. They had built a place where shadows could train for killings that would never be admitted. The second caliber was no longer a mystery. It was evidence of a hidden program, a chamber where silence was perfected alongside aim. As Luca extinguished the lantern and made his way back through the tunnels, the gardens above seemed different in his mind. Their beauty was only a veil. Beneath the roses and fountains lay a bunker built for secrets, a place where the phantom bullet had been born. And now, Luca carried the weight of knowing it was never phantom at all. It was real, and it had been waiting in the dark all along. The room was dim and smelled faintly of mildew, a forgotten corner of the apostolic palace that Sister Caterina had unlocked with a key she swore she should not have. Luca followed her inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom until he saw the wall. A large map stretched across it, mounted on faded cork, its edges curled with age. At first, it looked like an ordinary floor plan of the Vatican, the kind of diagram given to tourists in tidy folds. But this was no tourist map. It was scarred with punctures, crisscrossed with threads of red string, and marked with pins hammered into precise places. Caterina gestured with a gloved hand. Each pin, she explained, represented a site tied to the captain's final days. The first was obvious, the Swiss Guard barracks. A black pin, darker than the rest, pierced its square on the diagram. From it, a red thread stretched toward the Secretariat's annex, a building known more for paperwork than mystery. Yet here, it was marked with a deep crimson dot, as if the ink itself had been chosen for blood. Another line stretched outward, toward a location Luca did not recognize. Caterina's voice dropped as she named it. An off-books clinic hidden within the Vatican walls, a place where no pilgrim or priest ever walked. The clinic did not appear in official registries. It was where Section S had sent men who could not appear in public hospitals, men carrying wounds that could never be explained. The thought chilled Luca. Medicine turned into another form of secrecy. Then his eyes followed the final thread, one that wound like a vein back into the heart of the palace itself. A private archive, separate from the grand vaults known to scholars, a smaller chamber whispered of only in rumour. It was said to contain the documents too dangerous, even for the Vatican Library, reports, testimonies, and ledgers tied not to theology, but to operations hidden beneath the veil of faith. The pin marking, it gleamed gold, as though to signal that this was the crown of the entire network. Luca stepped closer, his eyes tracing the connections. The map was not random, it was a system. The barracks provided men, the Secretariat wrote orders, the clinic erased traces. The archive preserved the truth in silence. 4 places, bound together by red string, each one part of a machine that turned loyalty into obedience, and obedience into complicity. He realized the captain must have uncovered this very pattern, pulling at the threads until he had seen the shape of the web, and for that, he had been silenced. Caterina whispered that maps do not lie, only those who draw them. This one had been crafted by someone who knew the game too well, someone who had chosen to mark not roads or buildings but secrets. Luca felt the weight of it sink into him. He understood now that the Vatican was not one fortress, but many, each chamber feeding the others, each secret defended not by walls but by silence. The map of complicity was not ink on paper, it was the blueprint of a hidden empire, and Luca now stood inside its borders. The widow sat in a modest parlour, the curtains drawn against the noise of Rome beyond her window. Her eyes were swollen from nights of grief, yet her spine remained unbent. On the table before her lay an envelope sealed with wax, the insignia of the Secretariat pressed into its surface. She had been told it contained a gesture of compassion, a pension to support her now that her husband was gone. But as she broke the seal, she saw the truth written in elegant but merciless words. It was not a gift, it was a price. The letter promised financial security for the rest of her life, a steady income that would keep her from want. In return, she need only remain silent, to refrain from asking questions, to stop pressing for answers about the night her husband died. The tone was kind on the surface, but beneath it lay the weight of command. The offer was not optional. It was a leash disguised as charity. But there was more. In careful phrasing that chilled her blood, the letter reminded her that her marriage had been solemnized under the recognition of the Church. Such recognition could be reviewed, even annulled, should scandal arise. If she resisted the offer, if she refused the pension, the Church could declare her marriage null. Overnight, she would become not a widow but nothing at all, her union erased from record, her years with her husband reduced to sin. She clenched the letter in trembling hands, rage and sorrow tearing at her heart. To lose him once was unbearable. To be told their bond could be undone by decree was a cruelty beyond words. She thought of the vows spoken before the altar, the ring that still pressed against her finger, the whispered promises she and her husband had shared in the dark. Could all of that be erased with a stroke of a pen? She folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Outside, the bells of St. Pietas rang as though nothing had happened, as though her life had not been shattered. She understood now that her silence was not merely desired, it was demanded, enforced by threats that struck at the very core of her memory. When Luca visited her later, she showed him the letter, her voice low but steady. She told him she would not take the pension, that money could not buy her loyalty, that the Church could not undo what God had witnessed. Yet her eyes betrayed fear. She knew the cost of refusal. She knew they could strip away not only her security, but her very identity as a wife. Luca took the letter, his jaw tightening as he read. He had already seen how truth was erased in records and maps. Now he saw how it was erased in lives. The widow's price was not measured in coins, but in memory. They wanted her to vanish, just as they had made the captain vanish. And in that moment, Luca swore he would not let her stand alone. For if silence could be bought, then truth needed someone willing to pay a greater price. The priest was not like the others. He wore the black cassock of a Jesuit, but his chambers were filled not with icons or relics, but with stacks of charts, notebooks, and strange devices wired together in ways few outside his order would understand. They called him a statistician, though his mind seemed more like that of an astronomer or detective. When Luca and Sister Caterina approached him, he listened with sharp eyes as they explained the erased footage, the looping camera, the missing evidence. Then, almost with a smile, he told them the walls themselves could not lie. He began with the fountains. St. Peter's Square was never still. Its waters caught the lamplight, and each ripple mirrored movements too small for the human eye to notice. The priest had collected hours of footage from nearby cameras, not of the bronze door itself, but of the surrounding fountains. He showed Luca how the ripples bent unnaturally at certain intervals, disturbances that aligned with the time of the captain's death. Each distortion was a clue, like a fingerprint pressed into water. Next he turned to the marble. The square's polished surfaces reflected more than pilgrims' footsteps. They caught shadows cast by figures who passed in silence. By running calculations, frame by frame, he pieced together the outlines of men who should not have been there. Two figures, moving at angles inconsistent with the patrol routes, slipped across the marble like ghosts. Their bodies never appeared directly, but their presence was betrayed in the faint bending of light. With each calculation, with each graph drawn in ink, the erased night began to live again. The Jesuit overlaid the fountain ripples with the marble shadows. constructing a map of movement. He pointed to one shape that matched the posture of the captain, walking swiftly toward the bronze door. Another shadow flanked him, taller, heavier, carrying something that glinted for a split second in reflection. And then came the second silhouette, smaller, positioned at an angle that confirmed what the forensic whispers had suggested all along. 2 weapons, 2 calibers. Luca stared in awe as the priest reconstructed the impossible. Where cameras had lied, nature itself had remembered. The water and stone had kept their own record, silent but undeniable. It was not a clear picture, not enough to hang in a courtroom, but it was proof that the official story could not stand. The captain had not fallen alone. He had been surrounded. The Jesuit folded his notes with care and warned Luca to guard them as if they were relics. He said numbers could be as dangerous as bullets when they threatened power. Luca nodded, tucking the pages into his coat. He felt the weight of them press against his chest, heavier than steel. For the first time since the night of the captain's death, the silence had been broken not with testimony but with mathematics. The Jesuit had shown him that even in the Vatican, where truth was buried in archives and locked behind oaths, shadows and ripples could still speak, the reliquary chamber glowed with a strange mixture of reverence and unease. Glass cases lined the walls, each containing fragments of saints long gone, bones and cloth preserved as if time itself dared not touch them. Pilgrims believed these relics carried grace, but those who worked inside the Vatican knew they also carried weight of another kind. They were treasures beyond price, objects moved with ceremony, guarded by lists more sacred than ledgers of gold. Sister Caterina led Luca into the chamber late one evening, her gloves already on, her eyes sharp with worry. She produced a small book, the relic inventory for the week of the captain's death. Written in careful Latin, each line documented the movement of bones, chalices, and fragments of saints. Luca scanned the list, his gaze falling on an entry dated the very night of the murder. Saint Felician's finger bone, removed for veneration, returned the next morning. Nothing unusual at first glance. Yet Caterina leaned closer, her voice nearly a whisper. The reliquary that held the finger bone had not been opened in decades. There was no feast day, no reason for it to be displayed, and yet the inventory recorded a substitution. Together, they inspected the reliquary itself. Beneath the golden clasp lay a finger bone wrapped in silk, but Caterina's trained eye saw the difference. The silk was not the same as described in the older records. It had been changed, too new, too clean. Someone had opened the reliquary on the night of the captain's death and replaced its contents. But why risk such a dangerous act under the eyes of the guard? Luca pieced it together slowly. Relics drew reverence, and reverence drew access. If a reliquary was carried through the halls, no guard would question it. No door would be closed. The bone had become a vessel, not only of faith but of smuggling. Something had been hidden inside the reliquary during those hours. Something moved under the cover of veneration. By morning it had been switched, the relic restored, the hidden cargo gone. He thought of the foreign operative in the photograph, the ghostly pilgrim with no fingerprints, the secret firing lanes beneath the gardens, all pointed to networks of movement and concealment. The finger bone was another link, a disguise so holy no one would dare touch it. Perhaps documents, perhaps microfilm, perhaps even a weapon small enough to hide inside. Whatever it had been, the captain must have known, and for knowing, he had died. Caterina closed the inventory with trembling hands, her lips pressed tight. She reminded Luca that the church had survived for centuries, not only on faith, but on control, and relics had always been part of that control. Tonight, he had seen how easily holiness could be turned into camouflage. The reliquary gleamed in the candlelight, the bone within seeming to stare back at them with silent accusation. It was no longer only the finger of a saint, it was evidence that even sacred things could be hollowed out to serve shadows. The barracks were silent when Luca slipped into the watch office. The duty roster hung neatly on the wall, its ink still sharp, its columns filled with the familiar rhythm of names and shifts. He had studied it before, but tonight his eyes were sharper, his suspicion heavier. He traced the night of the captain's death and noticed something odd. The captain's name appeared where it should not have been. According to the pattern, another officer had been scheduled for that watch. Luca leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass over the roster. He saw faint traces where ink had been altered, the impression of a different hand beneath the captain's name. Someone had been reassigned at the last moment, and the captain had stepped in to cover. But why would he take another man's place on such short notice? And, more importantly, had the bullet been meant for him at all? His mind raced as he cross-checked old records, pulling rosters from previous weeks. The handwriting told the story. The officer originally scheduled was Lieutenant Bernard Keller, a man of quiet presence but high responsibility, often stationed close to the Secretariat's annex. Keller's record was unblemished, his loyalty unquestioned. Yet Luca could not ignore the coincidence. If Keller had stood watch that night instead of the captain, it would have been him lying lifeless near the bronze door. The question burned in Luca's chest. Who was truly meant to die? Was the captain the target, silenced for uncovering Section S? Or was he an unintended victim, a man caught in the place of another? If Keller was the true mark, then the plot reached deeper still. Killing him would have shaken the guard in different ways, perhaps even shifted the balance of loyalties within the barracks. Luca remembered the widow's letter, the ledger of Section S, the photo of Monsignor N with the foreign operative. Each clue painted a picture of deliberate precision. Yet here lay a possibility of error, a misstep in the dance of shadows. Perhaps the conspirators had aimed at Keller, but struck the captain instead. Or perhaps the substitution had been no accident at all. Perhaps the captain had taken the shift willingly, knowing danger was near, choosing to shield another man from the blade. The idea unsettled Luca more than any bullet or camera loop. If the captain had died, not because he was hunted, but because he was protecting, then his death carried a sacrifice the Vatican would never admit. Luca stared at the roster, the two names etched like ghosts in the ink. One man had lived, one man had died, and between them lay the mystery of intention. As dawn crept into the barracks, Luca locked the office and slipped away. The roster remained on the wall, silent and unchanged. Yet in its faint scratches and altered lines, it whispered the question that refused to fade. On that night, at the bronze door, who had the shadows truly come to claim? The confessional stood in the side chapel, carved from dark wood, polished smooth by centuries of whispered sins. Candlelight flickered against its lattice screen, casting shifting patterns that seemed to hide more than they revealed. On an ordinary night, the murmurs within were of quarrels, doubts, and prayers for forgiveness. But on this night, the priest who listened, stiffened as a voice, spoke words heavy with dread. The penitent, cloaked and trembling, confessed not to temptation, but to action. He had aided what he called a necessary mercy. The priest leaned forward, pressing his ear to the screen. The words came in broken fragments, yet their meaning was clear. A man had been silenced, not in hatred, but in obedience to an order higher than conscience. The voice insisted it was done for the sake of the church, to prevent scandal, to protect faith from collapse. The death was described not as murder, but as mercy. Mercy, the voice repeated, as though the word could wash blood from hands. The priest's breath caught. He understood immediately that the penitent spoke of the captain, the guard whose life had ended in the square. His first instinct was to demand details, to press for names, but training held him still. The seal of confession bound him, a chain as heavy as iron. He could not speak of what he heard. He could only absorb the weight of it, the knowledge that shadows within the Vatican had turned the language of grace into the cloak of death. When the penitent slipped away into the darkness, the priest remained in the confessional long after the candles had burned low. His hands trembled as he clutched the crucifix, his whispered prayers more desperate than holy. He knew the truth, but he also knew he was trapped by vows older than his fear. By morning, others had already learned of what he had heard. At dawn, the barracks heard whispers of his reassignment. The priest had been ordered to leave Rome, sent to a distant mission far from the marble and shadows of the apostolic palace. The announcement was made with the language of duty, a new flock to shepherd, a new field to sow with faith. But the timing was too sharp, too exact. He had heard too much, and so he was removed, hidden beneath the polite disguise of obedience. Luca learned of it through Caterina, who had watched the priest depart with only a small suitcase. His eyes hollow, his lips sealed. He had no choice. To break the seal of confession would be to break the church itself. To remain meant exile. The confession lived only in his memory now, unspoken, but Luca understood enough. The words mercy and necessary were the fingerprints of Section S. They had killed the captain not out of rage, but to protect their secrets with the quietest of justifications. The confessional, once a place of cleansing, had become a chamber of conspiracy, and its whispers, though bound by silence, echoed louder than bells. The documents were spread across the table in Caterina's archive room, lit only by a single lamp that threw long shadows across the stone walls. Luca leaned over the pages, his eyes scanning rows of numbers, signatures, and seals. They had come from the microfilm hidden inside the halberd, now painstakingly enlarged and printed by the Jesuit statistician. At first, it looked like endless lists of bank transfers, dizzying strings of accounts routed through places most people barely knew existed. But Caterina's steady hand traced a line through the chaos, connecting what seemed random into something disturbingly clear. The names of the charities were vague and harmless, titles like Children of the Dawn or Pilgrims for Light, foundations that would inspire trust in anyone glancing over them. Yet each one was little more than a shell, a hollow vessel for money that flowed not to orphans or schools, but into accounts shielded by the secrecy of tiny microstates. Liechtenstein, Monaco, San Marino. Each transfer was neat, precise, carefully timed, and each one was signed off under the banner of Foundation Aurelia. As Luca followed the pattern, his stomach tightened. The transfers were not scattered. They lined up against dates that should have had nothing to do with money at all. On the days when relics were loaned to parishes abroad, when golden reliquaries left the Vatican under the eyes of the faithful, payoffs surged through the microstates. On nights when security posts were quietly downgraded, leaving gates less guarded and corridors less watched, the same thing happened. Money moved in silence, always in step with moments when shadows could slip more easily through the Vatican walls. It was too clean to be coincidence. The relic loans provided the cover, the holy excuse to move crates and packages without question. The downgrades in security made sure fewer eyes saw what else might be moving alongside them. And the charities, polished on the surface, carried the payments that ensured obedience. Section S did not rely on brute force. It relied on precision, on a system that turned faith into camouflage and money into chains. Caterina pointed to one date circled in red ink, the night of the captain's death. A transfer had moved from Foundation Aurelia to an account in Monaco just hours before the gunshot echoed near the bronze door. The sum was larger than the others, as though the transaction marked not only another operation but a final payoff. Luca stared at the figure until the numbers blurred. It was proof that the murder was not an accident, not even just a silencing. It had been a scheduled act, budgeted and recorded like any other transaction. The realization chilled him. The captain had stumbled not onto a single secret, but into the rhythm of an entire machine. Money, relics, security, all linked by invisible threads. And once he had begun to pull at those threads, Section S had cut him away. Luca sat back, the ledger heavy in his hands, his heart pounding. The Foundation's accounts were more than numbers. They were the fingerprints of complicity, showing how far the shadows reached, and now those shadows knew someone else had seen the pattern. The room was silent, except for the crackle of an old fireplace. On the table before Luca lay a vast map, its surface covered in careful marks made by a steady hand. This was not a tourist souvenir or a pilgrim's guide. It was the general's map, a strategic chart showing the reach of the Jesuits across the globe. Pins of different colours pierced its surface, stretching from Rome to the Americas, from Africa to Asia, from islands in the Pacific to remote villages in the mountains. At first glance, it looked like the simple record of missions, but Luca quickly realised it was more than geography. It was power. Mapped and measured, every pin marked more than a school or parish. Each was a foothold, a place where influence was planted and cultivated, often in corners of the world where governments barely reached. In South America, the map glowed with dense clusters, whole regions where Jesuit missions had operated for centuries. In Africa, the pins traced rivers and trade routes, locations chosen not for ease but for control. In Asia, the spread was thinner yet more deliberate, stations placed near ports and capitals where culture and commerce converged. The map spoke a language of strategy, each location chosen with military precision, though cloaked in the robe of faith. The general of the Jesuits was said to be a man of quiet authority, known by some as the Black Pope, his influence global, though his power was hidden in silence. This map was his view of the world, a reminder that while nations rose and fell, the Jesuit network remained constant, adaptable, enduring. Geography mattered because it was not only about territory. It was about memory, about planting a presence in every place where history might one day turn. Luca traced the lines with his finger, noticing how they connected to the very patterns he had seen in the Foundation's accounts. Relic loans, money transfers, security downgrades, all of them seemed small when viewed alone, but placed against the general's map, they were threads of a larger fabric. The Jesuits had eyes and ears in every corner of the globe, channels through which information, money, and influence could flow unseen. This was how Section S could hide, protected not only by silence in Rome, but by reach across oceans. Caterina whispered that geography was the oldest form of power. Empires had always fought for land, but the Jesuits had chosen a subtler path. They did not conquer with armies. They conquered with presence, embedding themselves in education, confession, and charity. By the time a nation realized the depth of their influence, it was already too late. They were woven into its schools, its leaders, its people's very faith. As Luca stared at the map, he felt both awe and dread. It was beautiful in its precision, terrifying in its implication. Every pin was a reminder that no matter how far he travelled, the reach of this network would follow. The general's map was not simply about where the Jesuits had been. It was about where they could turn the tide of power at any moment. And the captain's death, Luca now saw, was not just a Vatican matter. It was a piece of something far larger, written across the world in ink and pins. The Swiss Guard were known for their discipline, their precision, their unshakable adherence to ritual. Every ceremony was a ballet of armour and steel, every movement timed to perfection, every halberd gleaming under the Roman Sunday. Yet on one morning, as dignitaries filed into St. Peter's Square for a papal audience, something subtle broke the symmetry. It was not chaos, not rebellion, but a quiet misalignment that only the trained eye could see. The halberds, those tall weapons that had stood in flawless rows for centuries, were tilted, not at random, not through carelessness, but at exactly 23 degrees. To the crowds, it looked like nothing at all, a simple detail lost amid the grandeur of banners and bells. But within the guard, every man understood what it meant. It was the oldest unspoken signal, a way to speak without words, a way to shout without sound. A halberd line bent from its sacred posture meant that something inside the corps was deeply wrong. It was a protest older than any handbook, passed quietly from generation to generation. Only in moments of grave crisis was it ever used, and never before in front of so many eyes. Luca stood among his brothers in uniform, his own halberd angled like the rest. His heart pounded beneath the breastplate, not from fear of discovery but from the weight of what they were doing. They could not march to the Secretariat demanding answers. They could not accuse the hidden rotor or expose Section S, but they could let the world see a crack in the wall of silence. A line of halberds, bent just so, was enough to tell any guard who looked that loyalty had been betrayed. The officers noticed immediately. Sharp eyes from the upper ranks swept the formation, their jaws tight, their signals urgent. Yet they could do nothing in the moment. To draw attention to the protest would be to admit it existed. The sunlight glinted off the angled steel, each blade catching the light like a secret code. After the ceremony, the reprimands came swiftly. Senior guards demanded explanations, but none were given. Each man stood silent, bound by an oath deeper than fear. The tilt was corrected in the next lineup, but the message had already spread. Caterina, watching from the crowd, had noticed it too. She later told Luca that 23 degrees was not a number chosen by chance. In Guard tradition, it marked the 23rd Psalm, the one that spoke of walking through the valley of the shadow of death, fearing no evil. Luca carried the weight of that psalm with him as he left the square. The protest had lasted only minutes, but it was enough. It proved that others knew, that others felt the betrayal. The line of halberds had been their voice, their confession carved into steel. And though silence closed again, the memory of those angled blades lingered like a spark waiting to ignite. The Vatican could erase rosters and ledgers, but it could not erase the moment when the guard themselves broke formation to declare the truth. The widow sat at her kitchen table in the dim light of early morning, the fragments of her husband's cipher spread before her like broken glass. She had read them so many times that the paper was beginning to crease and fray at the edges. She knew what they meant, though not in full, and she knew what danger they carried. But silence had already taken too much from her. She refused to let it claim the truth as well. With careful hands, she divided the fragments into envelopes, each addressed to a different journalist she had heard of through whispers and late-night radio. None of them were mainstream voices. They were the ones dismissed as fringe, yet she knew they were the only ones who might dare to listen. She walked to the post office, with her head covered by a simple scarf, her steps steady, but her heart racing. Each envelope dropped into the slot was a small act of rebellion, a spark hurled into the darkness. She imagined them travelling across Italy and beyond, carried by trains and planes, reaching hands that would see the cipher for what it was, a door to a story too long locked away. When she returned home, she allowed herself a fragile hope, whispering that at least one would survive the journey. But the Vatican's reach was not idle. Days later, strange things began to happen. 2 of the journalists never received their mail. Their addresses later flagged for delivery errors that made no sense. Another reported that his office had been broken into, his desk ransacked, his typewriter ribbon cut cleanly through. A fourth, a young reporter in Florence, told her by phone that the envelope had arrived but was stolen the same night from his apartment while he slept. It was as if unseen hands had followed each letter, plucking them from the world before they could bloom. Only one envelope slipped through the net. It reached a journalist in Milan, a man known for chasing uncomfortable truths. He opened it, puzzled at first, until he recognized the fragments as pieces of a larger whole. He wrote back immediately, his words trembling with urgency. He understood the risk she had taken, and he promised to guard what she had given. For the first time since the captain's death, she felt she was no longer alone. Yet even that flicker of hope was shadowed by fear. Within days, she noticed a car parked across from her apartment, the same one appearing at different hours, its windows tinted too dark to see through. The phone clicked strangely when she lifted the receiver. Letters she mailed to friends went missing. The message was clear. She had been seen, and she had been marked. Still, she did not regret it. The fragments were out there now, scattered like seeds, and one had found soil, Perhaps it would grow, perhaps it would not, but it could no longer be erased completely. As she looked again at her husband's handwriting, she whispered the words he had left her: "Trust no cassock." She had obeyed, and in her defiance, she had kept his voice alive. The apostolic palace loomed with its layers of marble and shadow, a labyrinth where centuries of power had been carefully arranged to appear eternal. Luca followed Sister Caterina through a side stairwell that twisted upward into a space few had ever seen. The mezzanine was hidden above a hallway, reached only by a narrow wooden door concealed behind a tapestry. Dust swirled in the beam of Caterina's lamp as she pushed the door open, and for a moment Luca thought the place had been abandoned. Then he saw the cabinets. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, each marked with a neat label written in Latin. They were not names of places or men, but saints: Saint Sebastian, Saint Catherine, Saint Bartholomew, Saint Agnes. At first glance, it looked like a catalogue of relics, the sort of list one would expect in a Vatican archive. But when Luca opened the first drawer, his blood ran cold. Inside were not relics, but dossiers. Each folder contained photographs, receipts, reports typed on thin paper, correspondence signed with initials instead of names. He lifted one file labelled Saint Bartholomew and found records of financial transfers, identical in structure to the accounts traced through Foundation Aurelia. Another folder under Saint Agnes held photographs of men Luca recognised from the secret bunker beneath the gardens, their faces caught in blurred snapshots as they carried crates under cover of night. The saints' names were not holy references. They were codes for operations, each sanctified by disguise. Caterina flipped through the folders with gloved fingers, her lips pressed tight as though each page deepened her disgust. She whispered that Monsignor N, the man in the black cassock, had built his empire of shadows here. Every saint's name was a mask. Every dossier was a script for silence, carried out with precision and buried beneath devotion. Luca opened another drawer labelled Saint Michael. Inside he found photographs of the captain himself, copies of rosters, and a typed memorandum noting his unreliability. A red line struck across his name, followed by the word resolved. Luca's hands shook as he realized this was the death sentence, written not in blood but in ink, sealed beneath the name of a saint meant to symbolize protection. The irony bit deep, leaving his throat dry. They moved quickly, knowing discovery would mean disaster. The mezzanine felt alive with its own heartbeat, as if the dossiers themselves breathed with the secrets they contained. Luca stuffed several fragments into his coat, evidence too dangerous to leave behind, while Caterina whispered prayers that the saints whose names had been stolen might forgive the blasphemy. As they closed the drawers and stepped back into the stairwell, Luca looked once more at the rows of labels gleaming in the lamplight. To the Vatican they were saints, to the faithful they were protectors, but here they were codes for crimes disguised as miracles. The apostolic apartment was no holy chamber. It was a vault of deceit, where the memory of saints had been weaponized to hide the sins of men. And it was here that Monsignor N's true face lingered, written in every line of ink. The chapel was lit only by tall candles, their flames flickering against walls painted centuries ago. The scent of incense clung to the air, heavy and sweet, as if it wished to mask the unease that hung over the gathering. The Latin chant rose from the choir, deep and slow, filling the vaulted ceiling with echoes of devotion. To any pilgrim who wandered close, it was simply a night mass, another ceremony in a city that lived on ritual. But Luca knew better. Hidden among the robes and prayers were men who had come not to worship but to bargain. He knelt in the pews, his uniform hidden beneath a plain cloak, while Sister Caterina watched from the shadows. The clergy sat divided, their faces hard to read in the shifting light. When the choir's voices softened, one priest leaned closer, his whisper sharp against the silence. He spoke of Section S, of the web of silence that had strangled the guard and corrupted the archives. He told Luca that a faction within the church wanted the truth brought into the light, that they could shield him from retaliation if he carried the evidence forward. Their promise was bold: protection, sanctuary, even testimony before the world. But before Luca could answer, another voice cut through the shadows. A cardinal in crimson robes turned, his eyes cold and unblinking. He warned that such actions would bring ruin, not only to Luca, but to his soul. To expose the secrets of the Church was to defy the bride of Christ. The punishment would not be silence, but excommunication, a fate worse than death in a world where faith defined every breath. He spoke with the calm of a man certain of his power, reminding Luca that the Vatican could erase him as easily as it had erased the captain. The choir's chant rose again, masking the tension that pulsed like a wound beneath the prayers. Luca felt caught between two worlds, one offering him the chance to strike at the shadows, the other threatening to cast him into eternal exile. The priests' faces blurred together in the candlelight, some anxious, some resolute, all watching him as though his choice would decide more than his own fate. He realized then that he was no longer just a recruit chasing fragments of truth. He had become the fulcrum of a battle within the Church itself. Caterina's hand brushed his shoulder, a silent reminder that decisions made here could not be undone. Luca thought of the widow clutching her letter, of the angled halberds in the square, of the dossiers labelled with saints' names. He heard again the words of the Jesuit statistician, that numbers could be more dangerous than bullets, and he knew the truth was too heavy to bury. When the Mass ended, the candles guttered low, and the priests dispersed into the night. Some looked at him with quiet hope, others with silent threat. Luca walked out beneath the stars of Rome, his heart torn but his resolve hardening. Whether shielded or cast out, he would not let the captain's death fade into silence. The night Mass had shown him one thing clearly. The Church was divided, and his choice would light the fracture like fire. The barracks no longer felt like home. The walls that had once echoed with laughter, drills, and the steady rhythm of tradition now pulsed with tension so sharp it could be felt in the air. The Swiss Guard, bound for centuries by loyalty and silence, had cracked. Two factions had formed, and though no one spoke of them openly, every man knew which side he belonged to. The traditionalists gathered in the mess hall, their voices firm, their posture rigid, declaring that obedience was the only path. To question orders was to question the very oath they had sworn before God and Pope. They believed the captain's death was tragic, but unworthy of defiance. For them, duty was eternal, even if truth was buried alive. The reformists gathered in whispers, in corners of the courtyard, in shadows of the chapel. Their voices trembled with anger and conviction. They spoke of the captain not as a casualty, but as a martyr, of dossiers hidden beneath saints' names, of ledgers, relics, and ciphers that painted a picture too dark to ignore. They believed the oath was to protect not just the Pope, but the integrity of the Guard itself. Silence, they said, was no longer loyalty, it was complicity. Luca found himself at the centre of the fracture, pulled in both directions. The traditionalists respected his discipline, reminding him of the uniform that had been worn by generations, of the halberd he carried, of the honour that came from unquestioned obedience. They told him to let go of his doubts, to accept that the Church's ways were higher than his understanding. Their words carried the weight of history, the comfort of belonging to something unbroken. But the reformists looked to him with hope in their eyes. They knew he had seen the ledger beneath the Pietas, the falsified logbooks, the golden pins on the general's map. They knew he had spoken to Caterina, the widow, the Jesuit statistician. To them, he was not simply a recruit. He was a witness, someone who could no longer pretend ignorance. They asked him to stand with them, to be the voice the Guard had never dared to raise. The fracture showed itself during a routine drill in the courtyard. When the command was given to align halberds, the traditionalists snapped to perfect symmetry. The reformists tilted theirs 23 degrees, echoing the protest of weeks before. The courtyard filled with silence, heavier than any gunshot. Brothers who had trained together, now stood like enemies, steel gleaming under the sun, each formation accusing the other with nothing more than posture. Luca held his weapon, his heart pounding. Both sides watched him, waiting. The choice would define not only his loyalty, but the very future of the Guard. To obey meant safety, history, and the comfort of tradition. To reform meant danger, exile, but the possibility of truth. His hands trembled as he gripped the halberd, his mind filled with the face of the captain, the widow's tears, and the whispered warning, "Trust no cassock." He knew he could not stand in the middle forever. The fracture had split the Guard, and his choice would either heal it or drive it deeper. In that moment, Luca understood that obedience and truth could no longer walk side by side. One had to be chosen, and the other would become his enemy. The Vatican gardens were hushed beneath the night sky, their pathways glistening with dew and the faint scent of roses drifting in the air. A small Marian grotto lay hidden at the edge of the greenery, a shrine where pilgrims sometimes knelt in prayer, unaware of the shadows that gathered there after dark. Luca moved quietly among the trees, his heart pounding as he approached the figure already waiting. The black cassock was unmistakable. It was Monsignor N, the man whose name was whispered in fear, but never spoken aloud in daylight. N did not flinch when Luca appeared. He seemed almost amused, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, the faint glow of the grotto candles flickering across his pale face. For a long moment neither spoke, the silence heavy with the weight of everything that had brought them here. Then N broke it with a voice smooth as silk, telling Luca he admired his persistence. Most recruits, he said, would have bowed to silence long ago. Luca demanded the truth, his voice rough but steady. He spoke of the altered rosters, the disappearing cameras, the cipher hidden in the widow's letter, the microfilm found in the halberd. He accused N of orchestrating the captain's death. The words fell into the grotto like stones into still water, and for a moment Luca thought he saw the shadow of guilt flicker across the Monsignor's face. But instead of denial, N gave him something worse. He confessed. The captain had stumbled onto operations too large to be left in the open. N explained with chilling calm that relics, the very bones and fragments venerated by the faithful, had been moved, not simply for worship, but for trade. Each reliquary carried hidden cargo, documents, gold, or agreements, disguised beneath the cloak of holiness. The relic trafficking was no petty crime. It was the lifeblood of covert diplomacy, a system that reached across continents, financing negotiations and buying influence where open channels could not. N's eyes gleamed as he spoke, not with shame but with pride. He claimed this network kept the church alive, weaving power where politics faltered. Governments crumbled, alliances shifted, but relics always commanded reverence. No border guard questioned a holy vessel. No customs agent dared pry open a reliquary. Through them, the Vatican could move unseen, shaping events on the world stage while appearing untouched. Luca felt his stomach twist as the words settled in. The captain had discovered the truth and had paid with his life. N did not deny it. He called it necessary, a mercy, the same phrase whispered in the confessional. He told Luca the Guard was meant to protect not just the Pope, but the machinery of faith, however dark its workings might be. The death was unfortunate, but survival demanded sacrifice. Standing in the glow of the candles, Luca realized he was staring not at a servant of the church, but at an architect of shadows. The grotto that once symbolized purity now echoed with corruption dressed in holy robes. Monsignor N had spoken the truth, but it was a truth twisted into power, and Luca knew that leaving this garden meant carrying a burden heavier than any weapon he had ever held. The crypt was colder than the night above, the air thick with stone dust and silence. Luca stood beside Caterina as the lid of the coffin was pried open, the scrape of metal against marble echoing in the chamber like a scream. For weeks, the widow had pressed for answers, whispering that the weight of the coffin had felt wrong on the night of the funeral. Now, the truth began to surface, and it was worse than anyone had imagined. Inside the coffin lay not one body, but two. The sight froze everyone in place. One corpse was slumped awkwardly, its right hand missing 3 fingers, the bones cut cleanly as if to prevent identification. The other body lay on top, dressed in the uniform of the Swiss Guard, the captain's ring still gleaming on its hand. At first glance, it seemed to confirm what the world had been told, that the captain had been buried with honour. But the details betrayed the lie. Caterina leaned in close, her gloved hands steady as she examined the bodies. The missing fingers told her what the official story had concealed. One man had been mutilated, his identity erased so that he could not be traced. The other had been dressed and adorned to appear as the captain, the ring serving as the single token of recognition. Yet, even in death, the deception was clumsy. The height, the bone structure, the cut of the jaw did not match perfectly. It was not the captain, it was a double. Luca's stomach turned as he realized what it meant. On the night of the funeral, when mourners had wept and priests had prayed, the Vatican had buried not truth, but a cover story. The captain's body had been hidden, replaced with another corpse meant to satisfy ceremony while buying time for Section S. By the time suspicions arose, the lie would be sealed beneath stone, impossible to challenge without an act as extreme as tonight's exhumation. The widow stepped forward, her breath sharp in the cold air. She looked at the uniform, at the ring, at the mutilated remains beside it, and her eyes filled with tears not of grief but of fury. They had used her husband even in death, turned his honour into camouflage. She whispered his name as though calling him back, but the silence of the crypt answered only with the echo of her voice. Luca placed a hand on the coffin's edge, feeling the weight of the conspiracy settle deeper into his bones. The deception revealed more than a cover-up. It proved the church had acted with calculation, not impulse. They had gone to extraordinary lengths to confuse the trail, to obscure who had truly died and who had been erased. The captain's ring, once a symbol of loyalty, had become a prop in a theatre of shadows. The candles flickered, casting the faces of the dead in shifting light. Luca and Caterina stepped back, their resolve hardened. The second coffin was no longer a secret. It was proof that the Vatican's silence was not ignorance but strategy, a strategy willing to twist even death itself to guard the truth. The parchment lay on the table in Caterina's archive room, its surface glowing faintly under the lamplight. It was not official, not bound in seals or stamped with crests, but its words carried a weight heavier than any decree. Caterina had written it herself, her hand steady, her language sharp and clear. It was a new oath, one that turned centuries of tradition on its head. No longer loyalty to a man, no longer obedience to a throne of marble and silk, but loyalty to truth above all. She read the words aloud to Luca and the few guards who had dared to gather in secret. The cadence was solemn, echoing the rhythm of the oath they had sworn when they joined the guard, but the meaning was entirely different. Where the old vow demanded obedience to the Pope until death, the new one declared that silence in the face of lies was betrayal, that true loyalty meant defending justice even when it clashed with power. To swear this oath was to choose conscience over command. Luca felt the pull of history as the words sank into him. He remembered the day he had raised his halberd, pledging to defend the Holy Father with his life. That moment had filled him with pride, with purpose. Yet since then, he had watched the captain's death buried beneath false coffins, seen dossiers labelled with saints' names used to mask corruption, heard priests whisper that murder could be mercy. The old oath had become a chain, binding him not to God, but to men who twisted his name. One by one, the guards stepped forward. Their faces were pale but resolute, their hands steady as they pressed their names beneath the new vow. Each signature was an act of rebellion, a fracture in the silence that had held them captive. Luca signed without hesitation, the ink sinking into the parchment like a brand on his soul. As he lifted the pen, he felt the weight of the captain's sacrifice, the echo of the widow's warning, the courage of Caterina's faith. But not all could follow. Some guards stood frozen, their eyes darting between the parchment and the crucifix that hung on the wall. To them, breaking the old oath was unthinkable, a sin greater than silence. They shook their heads, their voices trembling as they refused. Better to obey and remain within the fold than risk exile and damnation. Their refusal stung, but Luca understood. The cost was too high for many to bear. When the last pen was set down, the parchment carried only a handful of names, yet those names glowed brighter than any seal, a testament that not all had bowed to fear. Caterina rolled the document carefully, her lips moving in prayer. The room was quiet, heavy with both courage and sorrow. The guard had split, not only in duty but in soul. The old oath still bound many, but a new one now breathed in the shadows, a flame that refused to be extinguished. And Luca knew that once sworn, this oath could never be taken back. The morning papers hit the streets of Rome with headlines that sent shockwaves through the city. Swiss Guard captain dead in Vatican cover-up, relic trafficking tied to secret unit. Bank accounts linked to Foundation Aurelia. What had been whispered in corridors and hidden in ciphers was now blazoned across every newsstand. Crowds gathered in cafes, their voices rising in disbelief and fury as the scandal spilled into the open. For the first time in living memory, the Vatican was no longer the one telling the story. The world was watching, and the keys of St. Peter rattled in nervous hands. Within hours, the Vatican responded. A press conference was convened in a grand hall, its walls hung with crimson drapery meant to radiate stability. The spokesman's voice was calm, rehearsed, and heavy with solemnity. He declared that Section S, a rogue group within the Guard, had been disbanded. He promised sweeping reforms, greater transparency, and stricter oversight of relic transfers and finances. He assured the faithful that justice had been served. When asked about Monsignor N, he confirmed only that the priest had been reassigned to a quiet post in South America, far from the Vatican walls. No mention was made of the captain's empty coffin, the double exhumed, or the widow who had risked everything to keep her husband's warning alive. Luca stood with Caterina in the square, watching the announcement on a broadcast screen. Around them, pilgrims cheered, believing that the darkness had been purged. For many, the sight of officials acknowledging wrongdoing was enough. They wanted to believe the keys of heaven had been polished clean, but Luca felt the unease settle deeper. He had seen too much to be comforted by promises. The captain had not died for reforms written in speeches. He had died for truths that were still being buried. That night, in the silence of the archives, Caterina opened a drawer newly stocked with files. Her fingers brushed against fresh parchment, the ink still gleaming as if it had been written only hours ago. It was a ledger, identical in style to the one they had found beneath the Pietas. The same columns of names, the same trails of money, and at the bottom, a new stipend line, its purpose vague, its codename written under the title of a saint. The pattern had already begun again. Caterina's eyes met Luca's, the lamplight catching the sorrow in her face. The Vatican had sacrificed Section S to save itself, cut away a hand to protect the body. But the machine had not stopped. It had merely shifted, hidden under new names and fresh accounts. The cover-up had ended only to prepare for its rebirth. As Luca rolled the ledger closed, he understood the truth. Power was not defeated by exposure. It was too practiced, too ancient, too skilled at bending shadows into light. The captain's fight was not over. It had only passed to those still willing to carry it. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's tolled midnight, their sound echoing across the city. To the faithful, it was just another night. But to Luca and Caterina, it was the beginning of another chapter, a reminder that the sword could strike, but the keys would always find a way to turn the lock again.